Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was April 20th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is in the Commune Register from Joan, and it's a really intense one. This one is addressed to the Bailiff of Girona, and it has to do with the anti-Semitic violence that has been going on in Girona all around since and after the Easter holiday time, so like Holy Week. We have had several documents that we've looked at about the problems with Christians doing violence against Jews in the city of Girona around this time. And you get a sense that Joan is trying to get his subordinates to do something. And it's not really working to settle things down. That there's just this steady procession of violence against the Jews of Girona. And that was my cat, Ghost, expressing frustration about that. I know, Ghosty, it is frustrating. All right, so let's talk about this letter. The content is really intense. So here's okay, all right, hold on. I just have to, before I get into the content, sorry, I know you're like, but you were just about to tell us this intense thing. Okay, hold on just a second. I want to tell you how I found out about this document. It's from Benjamin Gample's book again, where, remember, he's writing this book that is really primarily about the anti-Jewish riots of 1391 and how the royal family responded to them. But of course, he wants to give some background context, and to that end, he talks about things that happened earlier on, and he cites this letter. And this particular letter, he found out about from some other sources, including a dissertation, and which is following an article, but really, I'm looking at this dissertation, and I think it's discussed both in the dissertation and the article, by Alexandra Gerson, and the dissertation is from the University of Toronto in 2012. So Alexandra Gerson has really looked at a whole lot of documents about the relations between Christians and Jews in the Crown of Aragon around this time. She says in her dissertation that she's looked at over 3,000 letters. That is some intense dissertation work, because I'm, in this project, looking at 365 letters, and I'm feeling like that's a whole lot. All right, so I found out about this from Gample, who cited it from Gerson. All right, here's what happened. Sometime around Easter, 4 Christian youngsters, like teenagers it seems, like maybe on the older side of teenage years, they kidnapped a Jewish boy. Doesn't say how old he was, but probably in younger teenage years. And they held him prisoner somewhere, and then proceeded to give him a forced baptism. So they forced him into Christianity by giving him a baptism. And while to modern ears, that sounds like, oh, well, like if he was forced to be baptized, then it shouldn't count. But actually, according to the belief systems of this time, even if you were forced into the baptism, you were pushed across a line that you could not return from. So basically, the father of this boy, his name is Solomon Scaletta. He went to the king, and it seems that he went to the king in person, because we have in the second line of this letter, ad nos presentia, or presentiam. So he went to the king, like Joan heard this. It seems Joan heard this from the father himself. But there is a wrinkle in that idea, so don't get too attached to that scene, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. So somehow in presentiam, Solomon Scaletta comes to Barcelona and relates what had happened. And as the father is talking about this, he is explaining it kind of like a death, like his son has been murdered. The word at the end of line, well, the phrase at the end of line 2 starts with lacrimiabilis resenevit, I think is. So he received tearfully, lacrimiabilis. Am I saying that right? Lacrimabilis. Mabilis. Oh my gosh. Latin. Anyway, tearfully. And I would say that you could even translate that as weeping. That the father was weeping because he had lost his son due to a forced baptism. Now, does it mean that Solomon Scaletta would never talk to his son again? I mean, I don't think so. I think they could have talked to each other. But he's kind of not allowed to live in the house anymore. Because later on in the letter, Joan says, we need to make a plan for where this boy will now live. So he needs to be placed with a kind Christian family. Because what seems to be clearly implied here, and Alexandra Gerson explains this, and she's really studied this a whole lot, is that the son is not going to be able to live in the same house with his family anymore. And that the father has to go through a grieving process. Because from the father's point of view, if you get converted into Christianity by force or by will, you're probably not going to be with the rest of the family in the afterlife anymore. Like, the person is just lost. So it's really hard for us in our modern time to think of religious conversion as this point of no return, that you can't change your mind, that you're lost forever, that it's almost like a death. But in this time and place, 639 years ago, that's what this was. Alexandra Gerson makes a really important point as she's discussing this event. And it's one that I have to kind of sit with, because this to me seems like, well, if we've got this example written in the documentation here, this must have been something that was going on. That, for all the times that it happened, we get this one as like a tip of an iceberg that makes it into the archive. And it must mean that there are other occasions and that this was something that was common or not unheard of. But actually, Alexandra Gerson says we should not think of it like that. That as she has done her research, and by the way, her dissertation title is called Coping with Crises, Christian-Jewish Relations in Catalonia and Aragon, 1380 to 1391. So she looked at these 11 years. She's looked at 3,000 documents, not just from the archive of the Crown of Aragon, but other archives around. And what she says is that this is the only instance of a forced conversion that she has encountered in her entire research. So that it should not be seen as the tip of an iceberg. That this was unusual. That this was an episode that really was an example of how things had gotten very extreme in Girona at this particular time. So that to me was an adjustment that I had to make in thinking about this and how I approach what I read in the archive, that you can't always think automatically that you're looking at the tip of an iceberg. And so it takes a whole lot of expertise and relying on the work of other scholars to understand when is it something that you can say is the tip of an iceberg and when is it that there is no iceberg there. And that's one of the really fun things about history, is that you can think one of those directions, and then you do some more research, you find out some other scholars who've looked into it, and you can then correct that, and it's always unfolding, right? So that's a really great example of what's fun about history, even though, you know, this event itself is not fun at all. It's like really tragic and heart-wrenching. Goodness. Let's talk about the likelihood that Joan heard from this particular grief-stricken father in person. I am really trying to figure out if that happened. And I would say that if I just had this document, I would say yes, that Joan actually encountered this grief-stricken father. And remember, Joan himself is the father of a young son, Jaume, the Dauphin. So he might have had a particular empathy about this. But what we're going to see is that just in tomorrow's document, Violante, we're going back to Violante, Violante writes to the Count of Armagnac that Joan is convalescing, that there's been another round of illness. So part of me wants to believe that Joan was there when Solomon Scaletta showed up to Barcelona to relate what had happened to his son, and that they had this moment, father to father. But because Violante, in tomorrow's document, is reporting that Joan has had another round of illness, I just can't be 100% sure. I can't even be like 60% sure of that, because it's just so clear that the scribes and the officers of the king's court are keeping the business of the state going through this documentation, and that it's just, there's these moments where Joan is going to be too sick to do any of this work, and it's covered up by the documentation, which makes it seem like he's been working continuously without interruption across this time span, where we see in other letters that he was perilously ill. So we can't know for sure whether there was this scene that I would really like to believe, just because I'm into thinking of the pathos of it, really like to believe that it happened, that these two fathers had this moment together in person. But we just can't be sure. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job, because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.